Welcome back to World War II TV, and we are continuing our look at myths. Well, we tackled Rommel, and now we are looking at arguably the most famous and celebrated Soviet general, Georgy Zhukov. I'm joined once again by Val, otherwise known on YouTube as Improbable Matter. I'll bring him in now. Good evening, sir. How are you today?
Fine, thank you.
So, Georgy Zhukov, immortalized, if only in Death of Stalin by Jason Isaacs, right, coming in the room there, which you're going to use in your slide there. But Zhukov, you're making the case that he, about whether or not he was the greatest commander of World War II. So I'm going to hand over to you in a second. And folks, fire away with questions. And if we have time to do some at the end, we will. But basically, I'm going to hand over for Val to make his case.
Well, thank you. So today I would like to very much focus on the historical figure of Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, this figure has acquired so much of a mythology through films in the East and the West, yes, including the Death of Stalin recently, and a mythology, it must be said, through his own writings and his memoirs to some extent. But I want to kind of bring that back down to earth and to ground that and see whether he really was the best commander, and to bust some myths. And I know this is going to be controversial. Some people are going to say, well, there's no myth at all. He really was the best commander in World War II or in history or whatever, and nothing that I say is going to change their mind. But what I'll try to do is go through some of his more important battles and to critique them and see where we come out at the end. One way to see the real historical Zhukov rather than a fake impression in a humorous way is to, if you're looking for pictures of him, always try to look for a picture where he's not posing for it or he's not talking to anyone. So here, as on the left, where he's looking off into the distance, he always has this most dreadful scowl. He's mad at the world for just existing. And that's something that Ulyanov managed to pick up very well in his films, whereas Jason Isaacs didn't quite get that sort of inner rage. But anyway, let me just jump straight into it. So Zhukov did see action in the First World War and the Russian Civil War, so that's already a good start. But his first really major command was in the undeclared Soviet-Japanese battle in Mongolia at the Khalkhin Gol River, where he finished this sort of skirmish with a resounding victory, and a very important one, because if there was any chance that Japan was going to invade the Soviet Union, this effectively blocked that. And what he did to end this was to effect an armored double envelopment. So he kept infantry in his middle and put tanks and trucks around the flanks. Classic double pincer movement that everyone can recognize, which is, very good, a very solid approach. What I would say, though, is that at this point, Zhukov had the superiority in troops, to some extent, very much in the quality and certainly the quantity of tanks and in trucks. So yes, it was a victory, but he had superior resources, and in doing so, he still managed to incur very high costs. So he's able to win when he's got the advantage. That's not much of not much to brag about, but he also manages to take high losses. Now, in the interwar years, he plans for a war with Germany, which is also good. But once Germany does invade the USSR, he's very quickly sidelined. And it is only after over a month where he comes back to lead the first Soviet deliberate counteroffensive. So as you're probably all aware, when the Germans pushed into the Soviet Union, they were driving on Moscow, but then they paused the drive on Moscow and they diverted their tanks to the north and south. And as they did this, a salient, a bulge had formed around the Russian city of Yelnya. And Zhukov kind of determined to plan to eliminate this bulge, which he tried to do by a means of a pair of armored pincers. And he did do so. He did eliminate this bulge. He inflicted some losses on the Germans and so on, but he failed to fully encircle, capture, or destroy the full German forces there. So while he won a victory, he missed a major opportunity to inflict a crushing defeat. Now, after this, he does get Stalin's confidence back, and he is then sent to defend Leningrad, which is under threat, and he does so with the supreme amount of ruthlessness and cruelty. Of course, he threatens to have his subordinates shot for retreating. That goes without saying, but he even almost goes so far as to have their families shot. So if you give yourself up, if you don't fight to the last at the front, we'll find your family in the city and we'll have them shot. Even for the Red Army, this is too much. So he does defend Leningrad, but with supreme ruthlessness. He then goes on to coordinate the defense of Moscow, which he also does well. I can't fault him too much, although some of his poor leadership and very headstrong approach does begin to show. There's a famous sort of incident, though many other similar things did happen, but this is probably the most famous, where Rokossovsky, who's a very good commander who's serving under him, he wants to fall back behind one of the water reservoirs that Moscow has, which is the right call. Rokossovsky has to go above Zhukov's head to get permission to withdraw to this favorable position. Zhukov then overrules him. So there's this Zhukov just meddling with what are really good decisions by his subordinates, and he's overruling and so on. So this is kind of poor leadership. But okay, whatever. I'll still give him credit. So Leningrad and Moscow are hard-won defenses, and then, as you know, then he leads a counteroffensive out of Moscow to push the Wehrmacht back. So these are victories. I will then jump forward nearly a year to the Battle of Stalingrad, which, and in particular, when Stalingrad is encircled, as you probably all know, again, by a pair of converging pincers. This is called Operation Uranus. And Zhukov is often credited as this master planner who made all this happen. But in fact, he's given far too much credit, and he takes, frankly, too much credit for this, when the real planning for this Operation Uranus was done by Vasilevsky, and the real generalship was done by the front commanders, so people like Rokossovsky and Vatutin, among others. So Zhukov really does very little, but takes a lot of the credit, or is given the credit. So what was Zhukov doing during this time instead in 1942? Well, all year long, he'd been feeding his troops into what later became known as a Zhev meat grinder. As a result of those counteroffensives from Moscow, another salient had formed that the Germans are holding around the city of Zhev and others. And so this salient invited being surrounded, and Zhukov kept trying to do this. You can watch a brilliant description of these operations in Babadzhanian's video on screen there, and I'll link it later maybe. But the point here was that after repeated failures, Zhukov went for one more roll of the dice, for again a double pincer, armored pincers, to cut off the Zhev salient, codename Operation Mars. So remember Uranus in Stalingrad, Mars, another planet at Zhev. And so he intended to create an encirclement. This failed. And subsequently, the historiography has sort of said, well, this was never really supposed to succeed. This was a distraction maneuver. This was meant to funnel troops away from Stalingrad. It was just a feint. But really, and to be fair, things haven't been declassified and so on, so we may never know. But every indication seems to show that Zhukov really intended this to work. He intended there to have been two major encirclements and victories at Stalingrad and Zhev, and that this was just a genuine failure where he couldn't get it to work. So I'm going to jump forward a little bit, and again at the Battle of Kursk, you're probably all very aware of. Zhukov is often credited as some genius who masterminded this great defense, but really his contribution was quite marginal. The real firstly, it was the Wehrmacht's battle to lose. They attacked prepared positions, as we all know. The Soviet real triumph was at the ground level. It was things like that you talk on this channel a lot about, the pack fronts, the new tactics, materiel, lend-lease, all these sorts of things. And any good generalship that was shown again by the front commanders, who would have guessed it? It's Rokossovsky and Vatutin again from Stalingrad. So Zhukov really had very little impact here materially. So I'm going to jump forward now nearly a year. And so after the Battle of Kursk, Vatutin takes his front forward, but is then killed. And Zhukov is sent out to be a front commander. He's not coordinating fronts anymore. He is the front commander, so the buck stops with him. And so he goes on the offensive. He takes advantage of very weak German defenses, breaks through them very easily, and he manages to encircle the 1st Panzer Army around a place called Kamenets-Podilsky. So he encircles an entire army. This should be a victory as great as Stalingrad. Except this time, unlike at Stalingrad, where there was a chance that the Germans had reserves that could break in from the outside, this time the Germans had very few reserves outside this pocket. D-Day was going to happen soon. They knew that. So Zhukov had this entire army fully encircled, no help coming from the outside. He had them banged to rights. But he managed to let them slip away. They managed to break out. Certainly the Wehrmacht took some losses, but so did the Red Army. The Red Army did take back ground, a lot of ground, liberated a lot of Ukraine. That's good, but a chance to inflict this crushing defeat and a whole army destroyed was missed. And they got out, and a lot of some of their equipment had to be left behind, of course, but a lot of their equipment did get out, and it's a Panzer army, remember? So if it had been destroyed, that's a lot of Tiger IIs or whatever the flashy things that would have been captured. So another missed opportunity by Zhukov. And so I'll step forward another almost a year to his final major battle of the war, the Battle of Berlin. So what had been happening in the latter stages of World War II with the Red Army and the Wehrmacht is that they were in a kind of game of cat and mouse. So the Red Army, as you know, was getting more and more artillery. This is the God of War, Stalin's hammer, whatever you want to call it. They had more and more artillery that in an offensive, they were able to set it up, stockpile ammunition, and when they went for the attack, that artillery was capable of just vaporizing the front line defenses that the Germans had set up. So what they did was they'd react to that by having multiple lines of defenses. They'd have just a single line in front. They expected that to be hit hard, but as that artillery barrage began, they then prepared to withdraw into a second prepared line and to offer a strong resistance from the second line. So the Soviet commanders, they also cottoned onto this, and now they knew, okay, the Germans, they're going to start withdrawing, so we're going to have to also find out, we're going to have to identify and mark and so on the second line. We're going to have to hit that as well. We're going to hit the lines of communications between the two. So there was this, play and counterplay developing for the Soviets, how to develop an offensive and how to break through a well-prepared defense. This is what the Germans had on the Zelo Heights in front of Berlin. So between where the Soviets began at the Kustrin bridgehead and Berlin, there was a sort of ridge line, high ground around the town of Zelo, and the Germans had two lines of defense prepared for exactly this eventuality. The Red Army commanders said, okay, well, we got to deal with this. We got to hit both the lines of defense. We know how to work with this. Zhukov ignored this. He said, just hit the front line with everything you got. He had overwhelming amounts of artillery, which rightly vaporized the front so much that it was quite literally a walkover. That's great. The first line of defense fell, but that second line kept the Red Army up for days. It delayed the whole offensive and cost the Red Army very heavily in terms of losses. Once they did break through that line, they were able to stream on and enter Berlin itself. And when the Red Army entered there, once again, Zhukov was effectively feeding troops into a meat grinder again. There was certainly no great generalship. There was no chess master command, four-dimensional chess, nothing like that. It was just a very kind of plodding, sort of ham-fisted approach to just grinding the defense down. So once again, a victory, certainly, but this was at the end of the war when a victory was assured. Anyone could have won this, but Zhukov did so in a very costly manner, losing a lot of soldiers' lives unnecessarily. So I'll sum up from that. So when he had a superiority in resources, Zhukov often managed to take heavy losses. He often missed opportunities which a better commander would have been able to make good on and to encircle or destroy enemy formations. And what's really kind of damning, I guess, is that Zhukov never really learned, or didn't seem to learn very much. I mean, Yelnya was a missed opportunity, as I mentioned, but it would have been excusable if he had learned from it and then later on at Kamenets-Podilsky had succeeded in the encirclement and destruction of First Panzer Army. But there was no real learning stage there. And another thing that I think that kind of makes a lot of his drawbacks, at least sort of understandable, is a psychological issue. So it's the fact that because Zhukov was such a hard ass and so ruthless to his own troops, this meant that his subordinates would have been unwilling to speak up. They would have been unwilling to give him bad news. So like let's imagine you are due to lead one of those armored pincers, but your supplies are late. You haven't got your supplies. Now, the right thing to do would be tell Zhukov. He then postpones the offensive for a couple of days or whatever. You get your supplies and the plan will work. But are you going to tell him that and risk being shot? Or are you going to go ahead anyway? And then you're going to go ahead without your supplies and you're going to fail. Or let's say the Germans are breaking out again, like Kamenets-Podilsky. Let's say, that you're being hit hard. The Germans are trying to break through. You're in line of their main effort. You need reinforcements. But are you going to risk telling Zhukov that you're struggling to hold your positions, that your line's giving way? Or are you going to quiet down and just hope for the best, keep Sturm, right? So bad news would not have filtered up, and I think he was really hampered by this. And that kind of explains a lot of his failures. It's a bit like Darth Vader from Star Wars, if you remember those films, where he literally chokes anyone who tries to give him bad news. And then they don't give him bad news. And then, the rebels get away or whatever. So, and had he just listened to his subordinates, things would have gone better. So that, I think, is Zhukov. So, but this begs the question: if he wasn't the best, now, I should say another thing. I by no means would I say that he was bad.
Yeah,
and exactly. In the Red Army, which has been purged, being competent, having a modicum of talent, is already a huge, step above most of them. And nor were these problems that I mentioned unique to him.
Yeah.
They certainly many other Red Army commanders repeated those mistakes also, but I think this disqualifies him from being the best in the Red Army. He very much had his flaws, and these problems, which may have been ubiquitous, other commanders were able to deal with them better. So if he isn't the best or wasn't the best in the Red Army, then who was? It begs the question. Well, Zhukov was very much at the top of the Red Army, but alongside him, Deputy Defense Minister was Vasilevsky, who firstly he planned the Stalingrad operation. He was the actual person in charge of the planning there, and he planned and executed the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. Very little talked about, but very successful for the Soviets. They faced like a 1 million strong group and huge distances and so on, and he planned all that, executed it, and it went fantastically. So he, frankly, I think he's probably as good as Zhukov, but he just doesn't have good PR. He never blew his own trumpet, so to speak, and no one really blew it for him. So he's just he's not been as talked about. Now, one step below that in the sort of hierarchy was Rokossovsky, ace in the hole. I don't need to say very much more about him. You can watch this great video on this channel. But going one step lower again is another somewhat unknown name of Mikhail Katukov, who was an excellent commander of armored and mobile forces. He, he began commanding tanks. He held the line at Moscow. He held the line at Kursk. He also took part in the Berlin operation and others as well. Very underrated commander, and one who also deserves, I think, to be sort of talked about more.
Yeah.
So I think that's it from me. I think I'm within time.
Yeah, well, brilliant job, and we'll do a few questions. And I think your comment there that was perhaps the most pertinent was that not being the greatest doesn't mean you're bad. It just means you're not the greatest. It's that I can think of many football players who've played for my team who I liked, but they're not. They shouldn't be on the Hall of Fame. They shouldn't be. They shouldn't have a statue. And I think the minute you talked about as the greatest of all time, you've got to have something to back it up. And I'm not an Eastern Front guy, but most of the generals I think that could be considered great have at least one thing they're very good at beyond being good at the PR. They're good at maneuver. They're good at logistics. They're good at something. And when you talk about the show with Prit Bhutar in the Rizhev area, that was his backyard. He should have known that guy. He was on home turf there, and he didn't grasp the terrain very well. So that suggests he's not good at the ground. He's obviously not terribly good at he's not someone that his men love, so he's not good at man management necessarily. Well,
so okay, so if you want to say that, then what he's good at, if
right.
there's one thing that it's when you've got the back to the wall, when it's like the Leningrad and the defense of Moscow, when you do need someone who's going to be uncompromising. And to be fair, I think he would have fought to the last, or he'd have been out there with a rifle or whatever. So yeah, the one thing that he'd be really, really good for is to just hold on and just be unrelenting. If you need someone to be a rock, he'll shoot half his men before the Germans shoot them, but he won't give that position up. So that's good, but that's probably not a war-winning, strategic sort of move, right?
Yeah. So we'll do a few of the questions and comments. Some are questions, some are comments, but I'll kind of let you feedback. So Peter kind of asked right at the beginning, when did Stalin decide Zhukov was so impressive that he became a threat? Because we haven't kind of gone into that kind of politics of it all there. What have you got a take on that?
So he was, of course, he was being sidelined, as I mentioned, right at the start. It's amazing that, you'd think that from the 22nd of June, Zhukov would be the most important, but actually he got somewhat sidelined. That was less political, I think. Certainly, riding the white horse at Victory Parade was probably when alarm bells kind of started going, if not already. But probably Stalin had his handle on a lot of this. He knew who were the political rivals and so on,
And then going back to Moscow, the question, did they win at Moscow because of or in spite of Zhukov?
It's hard to say. Yeah. As I mentioned, he overruled better people like Rokossovsky occasionally. So it's hard to say. That's a definite question.
And Alexander Fitzgerald Black is saying greatest at getting credit for the victory of others. That's we can think of other commanders in other nations that are quite good at that. That's a comment more than a question. HG is saying, what if Vatutin was stayed alive? Where would he be on the ladder of important Soviet generals?
Yeah, so very much he'd definitely be probably up there with Rokossovsky as one of the greatest. He was considered a chess master by his opponents, or nicknamed that. Very hard to say. He also, again, he didn't blow his own trumpet as much, so it's very hard to say whether he'd, trying to jostle for political power or whatever. But he was an excellent commander, and it's a shame we never got his memoirs, for example.
And this comment here, and please, everyone's entitled to their own opinion. As you said at the beginning, you're not going to change some people's mind. This is a representative of one of the kind of the people who like Zhukov. Say what you like. Zhukov was always in the thick of the fighting, and the big knock on him is his wins weren't stylish enough. I'd have him on my team. So it's the other point of view. There's a steadiness about him. He survived, didn't he? I mean, that's got to be count for something.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. Yeah, I probably wouldn't want to be in his army. My dream team would be Vasilevsky leading, then Rokossovsky, then Katakov, because these were people that really took care of their troops as well. So where would I want to serve is in that sort of hierarchy.
And the last comment I think I'll show is from Rob Crane there, and this is about the establishment of some of the reputation in that it's from the West as well as from the East. In a Cold War context, from Western perspective, was Zhukov a surrogate for Stalin? We can't praise the big guy, but we need to give someone some credit. So before the Cold War kicks off, there are if you search now, folks, there are so many photos of Zhukov alongside Montgomery and Eisner. He made sure he was seen at all the right parties in that time there, so he could be the figure on whom the West Allies can say, well, he was the guy that was on our side. Is there some validity to that, do you think, Val?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, firstly, deflecting stuff from Stalin, definitely. And I guess the other thing about Stalin, it's the management of Stalin, I think, is the important thing here. Is, a lot of this, a lot of these, say, failures or costly victories or whatever, it's because Stalin is driving. Maybe Zhukov didn't really want to go on an offensive here, or maybe he did want to delay and wait for reinforcements. But so it's how the different commanders manage Stalin is certainly important. Whether and of course Stalin wasn't always wrong, just as Hitler wasn't always wrong. You talk about this on this channel and elsewhere. How much of what Zhukov did right as well was because Stalin was urging him on. These are things that it's hard to know. So some things we'll never know. I think whether to hold the line, because one thing is they wanted to push potentially and maybe launch a preemptive strike from Kursk, and the defense there was really a good idea. So that's perhaps one of the greatest sort of. Whoever got Stalin to stop, and Zhukov did have a hand in this, to be fair, and not to go on the offensive, that's a major sort of point, I think, historically.
And I think also just thinking, but thank you for that, is that when we're talking about reputations as we're moving forward into fully in the internet era, is just the fact he was part of Death of Stalin means his name is in the ether, it's in the Google, and so AI. If you go into a pub and speak to lots of World War II experts, or in fact, how many Soviet generals can they even name? I struggle after 5 or 6. I know the names when I see them written down, but when I'm kind of in a pub having to give them, I struggle after a few. But Zhukov is the one most people could pull out of the hat, isn't it? And if that's the frame of reference, that he's the first name out of the hat, he's the first name in the media, he's the first name still being circulated, so there's that to his I don't know if it's to his credit, but that's a fact about him I think we have to accept.
Yep. He did bring down Beria as well.
He brought down Beria, which is So we could do a show on that. Beria, there's nothing good to say about that individual, is there? Good grief. Right, we will leave it there, Val. Improbable Matter. Links to Val's channel are in the description below if you haven't found it. You want to learn some science as well as your World War II, that's all there. But I will leave it there, folks. We've got a regular show tomorrow night. We're talking about Arctic convoys with John McKay. But thank you, Val. Thank you, Daniel, earlier. Thank everybody for your fantastic questions. This is Paul Woodard for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.